Okay, everyone, welcome back to another deep dive. We're so glad you're here joining us. Before we jump into today's topic, which I think you're going to find absolutely fascinating, I just wanted to take a quick second to genuinely thank you for being part of this. Your curiosity, your willingness to explore these subjects with us, it really does make these deep dives possible. If you're finding these explorations interesting, honestly, the best way you can support us and help more people discover this kind of content is just by tapping that like button, sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it, or, leaving a comment with your thoughts. Your engagement fuels everything we do here, so.
Yeah, thank you.
It truly does. Seeing your reactions and questions is definitely a big part of why we do this.
Absolutely. So today, let's dive into the story of a helicopter that maybe from the outside might have looked almost, well, unassuming.
Yeah.
It wasn't the biggest or the most heavily armed initially, but it became an absolutely essential, incredibly versatile workhorse for the U.S. Army for decades. We are taking a deep dive into the Bell OH-58 Kiowa. And this isn't just like a history of an aircraft. It's really a look at how operational needs can drive incredible adaptation.
Right.
And, maybe more interestingly, how challenging it can be to replace a platform that just, well, it did its job so well for so long.
And we're doing this based entirely on the stack of sources you, our listener, brought to us, detailing its surprising beginnings, the different versions it evolved through, its long operational history,
Yeah.
around the globe, and the complex story of its eventual retirement.
Yeah.
Our mission here is to pull out the core narrative of the Kiowa, what made it so vital, why was it in so many places for so long, and why was saying goodbye apparently such a struggle.
Exactly. What were the essential characteristics that made the Kiowa so valuable, and what does its story tell us about military platforms and procurement? That's what we're unpacking today.
All right, let's start at the very beginning then, because its origin story is, well, it's a little bit unexpected. This iconic military helicopter actually has incredibly close ties to a civilian aircraft.
That's right. The OH-58 Kiowa is directly related to the civilian Bell 206A Jet Ranger. Bell developed their design, the D-250, specifically for the U.S. Army's light observation helicopter competition way back in the early 1960s.
The LOH competition.
The LOH, yeah. The Army was looking for a small, agile helicopter primarily for observation, reconnaissance, and, utility tasks.
And initially, Bell didn't win that. The Army first picked the Hughes OH-6 Cayuse, right? May 65.
Correct. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn, one that really tells you something about the realities of military procurement sometimes.
Okay.
Hughes, despite winning the contract, they really struggled significantly to meet the production demands the Army laid out. They just couldn't build enough helicopters fast enough.
So the Army just waited? Or
No, they actually reopened the competition in 1967. And Bell, in the meantime, had refined their civilian Model 206A Jet Ranger. They resubmitted that design.
the civilian one?
Well, the refined version of it, yeah. And this time, they won the contract. They actually managed to underbid Hughes in this second round.
Wait, hold on. So they developed a design, lost the competition, then took a civilian version of that design, tweaked it, came back, and won the second time around by underbidding. That's quite a comeback. More than just technical, it sounds like a business win, too.
It absolutely was. And that refined Bell 206A became the OH-58A. It was officially introduced in May of 1969 and given the name Kiowa, honoring the Native American tribe, which, followed that Army tradition for naming helicopters.
Right, the naming convention. So the Kiowa was born out of a second chance after losing initially. What was its job right out of the gate? What did it do?
Its initial role was purely observation. Simple as that. It was designed to be the eyes in the sky, finding targets, scouting terrain, generally providing vital intelligence to ground forces or maybe other aircraft like the AH-1 Cobra attack helicopters.
Okay.
And importantly, these early OH-58A models, they were delivered unarmed.
It's just a scout. Seeing the battlefield but not really able to engage directly, that's a very specific niche role. But the Kiowa certainly didn't stay that way, did it? How did it evolve over its, very long life?
Yeah, it had a long run. There were incremental upgrades in the early years with A, B, and C variants. You saw things like more powerful engines introduced and some basic protection systems like wire strike protectors added.
Okay.
The OH-58C was a later model, had a more powerful engine again, and these distinctive flat windscreens. That was actually an attempt to reduce glint, make it less visible.
Did it work?
Well, it kind of had the unintended consequence of impacting the pilot's field of view slightly, so mixed results there. The C model actually ended up serving primarily as a training aircraft later in its life.
Gotcha. So minor tweaks, evolutionary changes. But the big transformation, the one that really defines the aircraft most people probably picture as the Kiowa Warrior,
Yeah.
that came out of a major Army program, right?
Yes, exactly. The Army Helicopter Improvement Program, or AHIP. This was in the late 1970s and early 80s. The Army realized it needed a much more advanced scout helicopter, particularly one that could operate effectively at night and had better navigation capabilities.
And the result of AHIP was the OH-58D. What were the really game-changing design features on this D model?
Okay, the single biggest mechanical change, the one that fundamentally altered how the Kiowa flew and operated, was the rotor system. They completely replaced the old two-bladed rotor.
The classic Huey-style two blades.
Right. They replaced that with a four-bladed, rigid main rotor made of composite materials.
4 blades instead of 2. That sounds simple on the surface, but the sources really hammer home how significant that change was. What did that 4-bladed rotor actually do for the pilots?
A couple of key things. It made the helicopter significantly quieter, which is obviously crucial for a scout trying to remain undetected.
Makes sense.
And it dramatically improved its low-speed agility. You mentioned that duck-and-run maneuver pilots talk about that increased agility was absolutely vital for them, operating low to the ground, popping up quickly to observe or maybe engage, then rapidly dropping back behind cover.
Right, a veteran's perspective in the sources really highlighted that need.
Exactly. That agility was essential for survival and effectiveness in that role.
So it wasn't just quieter, it could maneuver in ways the older version simply couldn't. What other big changes came with the D model? This was a major upgrade.
Oh, yeah. The D model saw a massive increase in payload capacity. Its gross weight jumped from the A models, roughly 1,450 kilograms, up to almost 2,500 kilograms.
That's a huge difference.
It is, and that matters when you start talking about carrying weapons or extra fuel or sensors. It also got a mixed-class cockpit, so digital displays alongside traditional instruments as backup. And interestingly, it was the first U.S. Army helicopter to incorporate the 1553 Davis.
The database, what did that allow?
It basically allowed it to share digital data directly with precision-guided weapon systems, which was a big step forward.
And then there's the feature you just cannot miss, the one that makes the OH-58D instantly identifiable, the thing on top.
Ah, yes, the mast-mounted sight, or MMS. It sits right on top of the rotor mast, looking, yeah, a bit like a beach ball, perched way up high.
It looks so prominent up there. Was that ever a concern, making it such an obvious target?
Well, any sensor sticking out is potentially a target, sure. But the advantage it provided really outweighed that risk. Inside that beach ball is a whole suite of sensors. A television camera, a thermal imaging system crucial for seeing at night or through smoke and haze, and a laser rangefinder and designator.
And how did putting all that tech way up on the mast, above the blades, change the game for the Kiowa?
It was absolutely revolutionary for reconnaissance at the time. It allowed the crew to find targets, figure out their exact range, and then paint them with a laser for guided weapons day or night, even in pretty poor visibility.
Okay, but the key was where it was mounted, right?
Crucially, yes. Because the sight was above the rotor, the helicopter itself could stay hidden lower down, using hills or buildings or trees for cover. It only needed to expose the sight itself to see over the obstacle. That massively increased crew survivability and its effectiveness as a sneaky scout.
Staying low, staying quiet, able to see over obstacles while designating targets. Yeah, that sounds like a potent combination for a scout. So with the OH-58D, the Kiowa Warrior was really ready for prime time. Where did it first really prove itself in combat?
Well, the Kiowa platform itself, the OH-58A, saw combat quite early on. It arrived in Vietnam back in August 1969, working alongside the OH-6 Cayuse.
Right alongside the helicopter it originally lost the competition to.
Exactly. And the sources note it was a tough environment. Around 45 Kiowas were lost in total through combat and accidents during the war. They even highlight specific tragic incidents, like the loss of aircraft 68-167-85 in March 1970. Warrant Officer Quick and Lieutenant Colonel Benoski were killed during a battle damage assessment mission. In another, 68-160-88 in May 71 resulted in the deaths of Lieutenant Nucky and Sergeant Taylor on similar missions. It was immediately clear that the scout mission, even unarmed, was inherently dangerous.
Absolutely underscores the risk. So it had a baptism by fire in Vietnam. Where else did the OH-58D, the Kiowa Warrior with the sight and the upgrades, make its mark?
Okay, fast forward to the late 1980s. During Operation Prime Chance in 1988, armed OH-58Ds Sometimes they were even called AH-58Ds, then were used to escort oil tankers in the Persian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War.
Escorting tankers.
Yeah, it was a pretty unique mission environment. They operated from mobile sea bases, basically converted barges, which meant the pilots needed special training for Navy-style deck landings. Really showed the platform's adaptability.
A scout helicopter doing naval escort duties, that really highlights the versatile part you mentioned earlier.
It certainly does. And then came the major test, the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. 130 OH-58Ds were deployed. They worked extensively with the AH-64 Apaches in what became known as the hunter-killer concept.
Ah, the hunter-killer team?
Yeah, the Kiowa Warriors would use their fancy sensors, the MMS, to find and designate targets, and then the Apaches would swoop in for the kill.
And the Kiowa's performance stats during Desert Storm were apparently quite remarkable, weren't they?
They were outstanding. The fleet flew nearly 9,000 flight hours and achieved an impressive 92% mission-capable rate. That's really high for combat conditions.
Wow.
But what's truly telling, according to the sources, is that the Kiowa Warrior had the lowest ratio of maintenance hours required per flight hour of any combat helicopter in the entire war.
Lowest maintenance burden in a combat zone? That's a huge logistical advantage. Less downtime, more time flying.
Exactly. It proved incredibly reliable under intense operational pressure. And they also integrated effectively with fixed-wing close air support, not just the Apaches.
Interesting. The Kiowa also had a unique role closer to home, right? Something here in the U.S.
Yes, the RAID program that stands for Reconnaissance and Aerial Interdiction Detachments. Starting in the 1990s, modified OH-58As, operated by the Army National Guard, were used specifically for counter-drug missions within U.S. borders.
Counter-drug with Kiowas?
Yep. And later that mission expanded to include homeland defense and border patrol roles. It's a less-known aspect of its service life, operating entirely domestically.
That is a surprising application for a military scout helicopter. Any other notable, maybe more tragic incidents from the 90s that stand out in the sources?
There are a couple mentioned. During Operation Just Cause in Panama in 1989, an OH-58 was involved in securing Fort Amador. It took fire and crashed. The pilot was rescued, but tragically, the co-pilot was killed. And another incident, really highlighting the risks of the scout role even outside active combat zones, occurred in 1994 along the Korean DMZ. An OH-58C accidentally strayed into North Korean airspace in bad weather, apparently due to a navigation error, and it was shot down. Chief Warrant Officer Hylaman was killed, and his co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Hall, was actually captured and held by North Korea for 13 days before being released.
13 days. Wow, those stories really underscore that observation is far from a risk-free job description. And of course, the Kiowa Warrior saw its most intense, most prolonged combat use much more recently in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Absolutely. During Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, the OH-58D fleet was worked incredibly hard. The sources indicate very high flight hours per month per aircraft, averaging around 72 hours in Iraq, and even higher, 80 hours in Afghanistan. This constant presence was vital for supporting ground troops.
And with that incredibly high operational tempo came significant losses, unfortunately.
Yes, the sources sadly document around 35 Kiowa airframes lost in total across those conflicts, with the tragic loss of 35 pilots killed in action or accidents. It was an extremely dangerous mission they flew day in and day out.
That's a heavy toll.
It is. However, there are also anecdotal accounts cited, stories of the Kiowa's small size and that agility we talked about, allowing it to perform life-saving rescue missions in really confined or difficult areas, even though it wasn't designed as a dedicated utility or rescue helicopter.
Wow. So it even stepped up for rescue sometimes.
Apparently so. By 2013, the OH-58D fleet alone had accumulated a staggering 820,000 combat hours.
820,000 combat hours. That number alone just tells you how integral this helicopter was to operations for well over a decade in those conflicts.
It really does.
Now, we've talked a lot about it being a scout and an observer, but the Kiowa Warrior designation wasn't just about seeing, it was about engaging, too. How did they give this relatively small helicopter some serious firepower?
Right. The Kiowa Warrior name specifically means it's the armed version of the OH-58D. It used universal weapons pylons mounted on stub wings, which allowed it to carry different combinations of ordnance depending on the mission.
So what kind of weapons are we talking about?
You'd typically see Hellfire missiles, primarily for air-to-ground targets, or pods of Hydra 70 unguided rockets, usually in 7-shot pods. The sources also mentioned it could potentially carry Stinger air-to-air missiles.
Air-to-air? On a scout?
Technically possible, yeah, But the sources suggest that wasn't a configuration widely used, especially later in its life. And very importantly, it carried a .50 caliber machine gun.
Ah, the .50 cal. And there's a really fantastic story about that specific gun, isn't there? It wasn't the original gun it carried, and the fix involved some real, well, battlefield ingenuity.
This is one of the great examples of how necessity really drives innovation, sometimes with surprisingly elegant, simple solutions. Pilots in theater, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, were reporting that the older XM296 .50 caliber gun mounted on the Kiowa was, well, inadequate and unreliable.
Unreliable how?
The sources describe it being called a one-shot wonder by some, which is exactly what you don't want when you need dependable suppressive fire or precision shots, especially in complex urban environments.
Yeah, a .50 cal that jams after one shot in a close fight sounds like a nightmare. What did they do? Did they have to develop a whole new gun system for it?
No, and this is where the brilliance or maybe the pragmatism came in. They looked around at what they already had available in the Army inventory. It turned out the M3P .50 caliber machine gun was being phased out from the Avenger air defense system.
The Avenger, that's the Humvee with the Stinger missile pods on the back.
Well, that's the one. It also had a .50 cal gun. So the idea was born, take the gun off a system that was being retired.
And put it onto a helicopter that was very much not being retired and desperately needed a better gun.
Precisely. And different Army teams, the sources mention AMCOM's MOPP shop, which sounds like one of their maintenance and modification teams, and the PEO for Aviation, the big program office. They worked together really rapidly.
Okay.
They developed a surprisingly lightweight and simple mounting system to put the Avenger's M3P gun onto the Kiowa's existing weapons pylon. They even managed to reuse the existing ammo cans and feed chutes from the Avenger system to keep it simple and cheap.
That sounds incredibly practical, almost like a junkyard build approach, but for solving a critical combat problem. What were the actual benefits of switching to this M3P gun?
The sources highlight several really significant advantages. First, the M3P had a much higher rate of fire, about 25 to 1,100 rounds per minute, compared to the old XM296's 700. That's a lot more lead downrange.
Big difference.
It also offered better penetration and had a longer effective range, out to about 1,500 meters. But crucially, especially for a helicopter where weight is always critical, it was lighter. It saved about 65 pounds per gun installed.
65 pounds, that's substantial on a small airframe like the Kiowa.
It is. And the sources even put a dollar value on that weight saving over the life of the aircraft, citing it as potentially saving something like $20,000 per pound over the long term in operating costs.
Wow. Any other benefits?
Yeah, reportedly it also reduced the noise and blast effects for the crew operating just feet away from the gun, which is a big quality of life improvement. And it was apparently easier for the maintainers to work on.
So, better performance, lighter, less blast, easier maintenance. Sounds like a win all around. How did the pilots react?
The reports coming back from the pilots and crews in theater were overwhelmingly positive. The sources quote things like, "No gun problems now," and pilots come back raving how accurate it is and how dependable it is. It was clearly a very successful, fast-track response to an urgent operational need using available government-owned equipment. Just really clever problem solving.
That story of adapting the M3P is a perfect example, isn't it? How the Kiowa story isn't just about the original design or these huge, expensive development programs, but also about clever, responsive innovation happening right down at the user level.
Exactly.
So, okay, we have this incredibly capable, battle-proven helicopter that keeps getting smarter and better adapted through things like the MMS and the new gun. But the story eventually does come to an end with its retirement from U.S. service.
And the retirement story is, in its own way, just as complex and revealing as its development. It's marked by multiple, very costly, and ultimately failed attempts by the U.S. Army to find a dedicated replacement for the Kiowa.
Right. This is where we hear about billions of dollars being spent without a successor actually emerging, correct?
Exactly. You have to look at the string of programs. First, there was the Light Helicopter Experimental, or LHX, program. That eventually led to the RAH-66 Comanche.
The stealth helicopter.
Yeah, very advanced, very ambitious stealth helicopter. But it was canceled in 2004. Billions spent before ever entering service.
Okay, one down.
Then came the Armed Reconnaissance Helicopter, or ARH, program. Bell actually offered the ARH-70 for that, which was based on one of their commercial designs, the Bell 407. But that program was also canceled in 2008 due to significant cost overruns.
Billions more. Okay, two down.
Oh, yeah. And then, most recently, before the final decision, there was the Armed Aerial Scout, or JOAS, program. That exploration was ultimately canceled in late 2013, again citing ongoing cost concerns and uncertainty about the final requirements in a changing budget environment.
So 3 major replacement programs over a couple of decades. Billions spent. The sources consistently point to figures exceeding $9 billion wasted on these failed attempts, and still no dedicated scout helicopter ready to take over from the aging Kiowa.
Precisely. And it wasn't just the big replacement programs, even planned upgrades for the Kiowa itself, like the OH-58F model and a potentially more extensive OH-58F Block 2, which was actually Bill's intended entry for that Trieste program, those were also canceled as the Army shifted its strategy towards divestment.
So after all that, what did the Army ultimately decide to do to fill that vital armed scout role once the Kiowa was gone?
The final decision, made around 2013-2014, was to divest the entire Kiowa fleet, phased out starting around then, completed by 2016 for the active Army force. And to cover the scout mission, they opted for a combination of existing aircraft already in the inventory.
Not a new helicopter then.
No. They decided to use the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter, shifting some of its mission focus towards reconnaissance tasks, paired with the RQ-7 Shadow unmanned aerial vehicle, the drone.
Interesting. Replacing one dedicated scout helicopter with 2 different types, a heavy attack helicopter and an unmanned drone. What were the trade-offs they were weighing with that approach?
Well, the Army's analysis at the time, according to the sources, found that this combination of the Apache and the Shadow drone could meet about 80% of the required capabilities for the armed scout mission. That was actually assessed as being better than the projected 50% capability they expected from just upgrading the Kiowa to the OH-58F standard.
So capability-wise, they felt the combo was better than just upgrading the old bird.
Correct. The Apache Shadow combo offered advantages in areas like sheer firepower, platform durability, and speed. But, and it's a significant, the Apache is considerably more expensive to operate per hour than the little Kiowa ever was.
Ah, the operating cost difference.
Yeah. Sources estimated that if Apaches had historically performed all the reconnaissance work the Kiowa actually did over the years, the total operating cost would have been something like $4 billion higher. However, by retiring the entire Kiowa fleet, pulling all those airframes, logistics, training, etc., out of the system, they projected saving about $1 billion per year in overall operating and sustainment costs across the Army aviation force.
Wow. Okay, so it was a complex calculation. Saving money overall by retiring the whole fleet, even if the platform picking up part of the mission, the Apache, is more expensive individually to fly.
Exactly. It was a big decision weighing capability, cost, and the future force structure they envisioned.
So when did the Kiowa actually fly its last missions for the U.S. Army?
The active Army OH-58D squadrons were pretty much completely phased out by early 2016. The forces note the last official live-fire maneuver exercise for the OH-58D took place in January 2017. The final OH-58Cs, the ones used mostly for training towards the end, were retired slightly later, in July 2020.
End of an era. And many of those retired aircraft didn't just go to the boneyard, did they? They found new homes with other nations.
That's right. A significant number were transferred or sold off to foreign military operators through various programs. Countries like Croatia and Greece are mentioned as examples that acquired fleets of former U.S. Army Kiowa Warriors.
So they continue to fly elsewhere. And just to bring it right up to date, very recently, in February 2024, the Army canceled another program, didn't they? FARA, the Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft. That was essentially the latest attempt to finally field a dedicated scout helicopter to fill the gap the Kiowa left all those years ago.
That's correct. The FARA cancellation just a few months ago really underscores just how persistent this requirement for a dedicated armed scout is, and yet how incredibly difficult finding a suitable, affordable replacement has proven to be for the Army. Decades now, multiple major programs canceled, billions of dollars spent, and the current solution remains that Apache Shadow drone mix.
It really puts into perspective what a unique combination of capability, adaptability, and maybe relative cost-effectiveness the Kiowa somehow managed to achieve for so long.
It certainly seems that way looking back.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Bell OH-58 Kiowa, its story is really one of extraordinary adaptation and resilience, isn't it? From those almost accidental beginnings tied to a civilian helicopter losing a competition.
Right.
It evolved into a highly sophisticated, heavily armed scout, the Kiowa Warrior, that was central to Army operations for decades.
Its distinctive design, particularly that innovative mast-mounted sight, truly defined aerial reconnaissance for a whole generation of Army aviators. And it served with incredible dedication and, by all accounts, surprising reliability through multiple, incredibly demanding conflicts all around the world.
And its journey, from that second chance origin story through those ingenious field upgrades like adapting the Avenger's .50 caliber gun, right up to the decades-long, ultimately unsuccessful struggle to find its replacement, it gives us a really fascinating look at the challenges inherent in military technology development, procurement, and sustainment.
Yeah, it highlights that complex interplay between constantly changing battlefield demands, technological ambition, the harsh realities of budgets, and just how hard it can be to truly replicate a platform that found such a successful, long-lasting balance in its particular role.
Definitely. The Kiowa's eventual retirement, being replaced by that combination of more expensive heavy attack helicopters and unmanned drones, especially after all those years of failed programs aiming for a direct, dedicated replacement, it really leaves us with a compelling question, I think. Does true innovation in military aviation always require a brand new, cutting-edge, clean sheet platform? Or is there maybe an enduring, perhaps sometimes underappreciated, value in optimizing, adapting, and brilliantly evolving existing proven designs like they did with the Kiowa to meet the ever-changing realities of the battlefield? What stands out to you about this long-serving little helicopter's remarkable story?